Hello again, everybody. So today's going to be this is going to be the final video for our class today. And so what we're going to look at today in this video is really kind of the high watermark of the civil rights movement during the period between 1964 and 1965. Um, Kind of the aftermath of the passage of Lyndon Johnson's landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we're going to kind of look at how all that plays out and also begin to look at sort of why the civil rights movement, after reaching this sort of apex of success that it does in 1965, eventually begins to fragment and um, really kind of begin to suffer a much wider societal backlash than it had in the years prior. And so that's really going to be our principal focus of this particular video, is that aspect of the civil rights movement. So to start off with, where we left off, we were talking about Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Now, one of the biggest aspects of Johnson's Great Society is, of course, the push for expanding civil rights. And Johnson definitely thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the pinnacle of this. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, just as a refresher, banned discrimination in most public arenas in American life. It banned discrimination in terms of accommodation, in education. In theory, it banned discrimination in voting. And it also banned discrimination on the basis of gender, something which would later, in and of itself, help spur the feminist movement in the latter part of the 1960s. This was viewed rightly by many as a massive and significant legislative shift, a massive and significant intervention on the part of the federal government in discouraging and dismantling segregation in the Jim Crow South. But many activists at the time argued that it didn't go far enough, that it merely was basically window dressing, that it dealt with some aspects of discrimination but left many others largely unaddressed. Um, this was something that Johnson himself, like his predecessors, John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower, was somewhat reluctant to acknowledge. Johnson really wanted to push through his anti-poverty programs, his war on poverty, and various other aspects of his Great Society programs. And after passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he was nervous about revisiting the issue of civil rights because he worried that, having already antagonized Southern senators and congressmen, that he might further antagonize them, lose their votes on issues that he wanted to pass if he pushed the issue of civil rights any further. So much like Kennedy and Eisenhower, Johnson ends up being forced to intervene by events that where activists end up taking the lead and basically forcing him to intervene. A graphic illustration of just how much work remained to be done on the issue of civil rights, even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, didn't take very long to materialize. That summer, following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, John Lewis's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, decided to set up a voter registration push in rural Mississippi. And they did so for a very simple reason. Mississippi was the most segregated state in the Union at the time, and they really wanted to push the civil rights issue there and register people to vote who had previously been disenfranchised by a variety of different means. Things like poll taxes, which literally require you to pay a tax to vote, or so-called literacy tests, where you will be given a test to assess your civic literacy, which of course were completely different for white and for black testees. A person who was white would be given very simple questions, where a person who was black would oftentimes be given off extremely arcane and non-significant questions to be asked, and so it was very unfair. Even if people managed to pass these literacy tests, which invariably the majority didn't, um, they had to, if a voting official decided you weren't going to be eligible to vote, you weren't going to vote. And so, with the promise of voting rights and guarantees of federal protection against discrimination in voting that the Civil Rights Act, in theory, provided, um, they decided to try to organize voters in Mississippi. Um, Doing so generates a fierce backlash from the local population. They're angry not just at the very idea that you have these northern activists, many of them white college students, who join with African American activists like John Lewis to try to organize voters in their states. But they're further antagonized by the fact that these northern white college students and the local activists that they team up with oftentimes mingle together socially, occasionally even dating one another, engaging in interracial dating, something which in many southern states at that time was, of course, illegal and would remain so until the 1967 Loving v. Virginia decision. Um, so there's a lot of things that end up happening. Um, and it starts kind of small fry with people, throwing rocks at people's cars and stuff like that. But then some churches begin getting firebombed. And then finally, it culminates in Philadelphia, Mississippi, with the local sheriff, who was also active in the KKK, and a group of his fellow KKK members um, arresting and then letting go and then murdering three civil rights activists, two white activists from the North and one black activist. The murders of these three civil rights activists, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, ultimately brings significant national attention. Initially, they were reported missing by their fellow activists and by their parents. Um, and after several weeks of them being missing, the national media attention mounts on President Johnson, and he then finally pushes the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was no friend of the civil rights movement, to involve himself in the case. Hoover and his FBI at this point had been much more interested in trying to um, basically stop the civil rights movement than they were in trying to aid it. They had tapped the phones of many civil rights activists, like most notably Martin Luther King, and had tried to discredit them in various means. In King's example, the FBI discovered that he was engaged in several extramarital affairs, for example. So the FBI reluctantly is brought into the case. Eventually, the bodies are discovered in an earthen dike outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. And the sheriff, his deputy, and many other local Klan members and some of them local business leaders are eventually put on trial in federal, not state court. The reason being that if they were tried in local state court for the crime that they actually were guilty of, which is first degree murder, premeditated murder, they would have been found, they would have been acquitted by jury nullification because the juries in the South were all white. And so, what the murder of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner during the effort to register voters during what was known as Freedom Summer really graphically illustrates is that, giving people access to a lunch counter or theoretically promising equal protection, equal employment opportunity, or equal access to schools isn't enough. You need to let people have that most principle, that most basic tool necessary in order to engage in civil society, and that is the ability to vote. And the reason for this is very simple. Juries are composed of rolls of eligible voters, of people in communities who are eligible to vote. And so, by virtue of the fact that African Americans in the South were subject to mass disenfranchisement. That meant that juries in the South were, like the voting rolls, exclusively white. And so, once again, this illustrates a need for a much more stringent federal law to protect voting rights. And so that then becomes the galvanizing principle behind civil rights activism going forward, is this push um, for voting rights and for greater representation for African Americans in the political process. Um, this also finds its way into the 1964 presidential campaign as well. When the Democratic Party held its nominating convention, um, a group of civil rights activists who refer to themselves as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which included amongst them a female sharecropper named Fannie Lou Hamer, they tried to attend the Democratic National Convention that nominated Johnson for the 1964 presidential election. They were turned away because Johnson was worried that their presence would antagonize the all-white, segregated official delegation of the Mississippi Democratic Party. And so that once again illustrates the need for greater inclusion. And so, following Johnson's reelection, early in 1965, um, John Lewis of SNCC and Martin Luther King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they both kind of joined forces with one another, which they hadn't really before. Oftentimes, the relationship between SNCC and the SCLC was at best tense. They joined together in early 1965 to try to launch a movement that will force President Johnson to intervene, that will force him to intervene in the area of civil rights. And much as had been the case in the 1963 Birmingham campaign, King and his advisors decide on a location where they know there is going to be significant media attention given to their protests. And so they choose the city of Selma, Alabama. Selma had a sheriff named Jim Clark, who, much like Eugene Bull Connor in Birmingham, was an open and unrepentant racist, an open and unrepentant segregationist, and who was known for using violence as a means of curbing civil incidences of civil disobedience. And so they ultimately organize a protest, a march from Selma to the capital of Alabama in Montgomery, which at that point the seat of government was occupied by staunch segregationist Governor George Wallace, who had famously pledged segregation now, segregation today, segregation for now, and segregation forever. And so they launched this march. They planned this march rather after several local disturbances, one of which resulted in a police riot that ended in the death of a local activist, an Army veteran named Jimmy Lee Jackson. And so they decided to organize this mass protest in Selma. Before they can even begin the march, they have to first cross this bridge, the Edmund J. Pettus Bridge, over the Alabama River. Waiting for them on the other side of the Edmund J. Pettus Bridge is more than 200 Alabama state troopers, as well as members of Jim Clark's sheriff's department, as well as a posse made up of local angry whites. As the 600 or so marchers make their way across the Edmund J. Pettus Bridge, they are attacked with billy clubs, tear gas, cattle prods, the like. And much like as had been the case in Birmingham, this is all televised. This is all caught on national media and is broadcast in the homes of millions of Americans. This causes something of an outrage and an outpouring of support for civil rights activists. Ultimately, many white religious leaders supporting King end up sending delegations to Selma to join the march. One of them is a Unitarian preacher named James Reeb, who is attacked in the streets of Selma and subsequently dies of his wounds. um, as a result of this. And so, as a result of the protests in Selma, which again attracts significant national media attention, and which again, in the context of the Cold War, do not look good for the United States or for the Johnson administration, they forced President Johnson's hand. Um, some argue that Johnson encouraged this um, as a means of creating the political pressure that he needed to introduce the Voting Rights Act. But whether that's true or not, whether he was the brainchild or whether it was King, the effects of the Selma March are nonetheless pretty indisputable. As a result of the violence meted out at demonstrators on Bloody Sunday, when 600 protesters were attacked by the Alabama State Police, as well as subsequent acts of violence committed against demonstrators in relation to the Selma March, President Johnson eventually introduces the Voting Rights Act, which bans most forms of discrimination in voting. It bans literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other provisions that had systematically disenfranchised African Americans. Notably, at the time of the law's enactment, it contained a provision that required federal preclearance, as it was known, before any changes could be made to the voting laws of any jurisdiction with a history of racial violence. Most of them located in the Deep South, but also some in places like the Southwest, like Arizona and what have you. And so the Voting Rights Act ends up proving to be instrumental in dramatically increasing the numbers of African Americans who not only are able to register to vote, but also the number of African American officials who were elected as a result of this. And so, as a result of the Voting Rights Act, true representative representation in Congress increases dramatically. Notably, some of the leaders of the Selma March, most notably John Lewis himself, eventually themselves are elected to various governmental posts, such as in Lewis's case, the House of Representatives, representing Georgia's 5th congressional district, a position he still holds. So, this dramatically improves all of that. Eventually, about 7 years ago, the Supreme Court would strike down a significant portion of the Voting Rights Act, that pre-clearance requirement that required states and jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination to get clearance from the DOJ before they could pass new voting laws. And as a result of this, in the years since, we've seen a dramatic spike, particularly in states like Alabama, of laws oftentimes passed under the justification of trying to curb voter fraud that disproportionately impact poor and minority communities. In Alabama, for example, there was some considerable controversy when a few years ago they passed a strict voter ID law that required all people eligible to vote in Alabama to present an ID before they could vote, and then proceeded to shut down all the DMVs in majority black areas. So, it's, again, not explicitly mentioned that it's designed to, keep this one group of people from voting, but pretty clearly it is. So with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement arguably reaches its moment of greatest success, its moment of greatest public support. But this really marks not necessarily the beginning of a increased period of even greater civil rights activism. It actually, in many senses, marks the beginning of the end. Much as Johnson's landslide victory in the 1964 presidential election actually marks the beginning of the ascendancy of a new political movement on the right, and the beginning of the withering of the fortunes of the liberal majority that Johnson represented. Similarly, the passage of the Voting Rights Act really marks the beginning of the end of the period of success for the civil rights movement, and really marks the beginning of a period where the movement is increasingly characterized by growing militancy, a dramatically increased and politicized white backlash, and growing factionalization within the movement itself that hampers its effectiveness. Um, all of these factors, much like Johnson's own political downfall, can directly be attributed, in part at least, to the effects that the Vietnam War has on American society, which is what we will begin talking about in our next series of lectures, which I'll post later this week.